They say that curiosity killed the cat, but it's curiosity that also brings us amazing things like the telephone, the television, the World Wide Web, and, of course, socks that change colors. Yeah, these things are real. They're called thermochromic socks. And they ray one of the coolest examples of how we can use science to add some fun to our lives. You may have seen those socks before. You know, those wacky socks that look white in the store. But once you put them on, they turn all sorts of other colors. At rest, molecules in a crystal are arranged in an orderly, repeating pattern known as a lattice. Now, if you take a regular old crystal like salt, for example, and you grind it up into a powder, its molecules are no longer arranged in a lattice. Since the molecules are free to move, the ones that are warmer will migrate towards the colder parts. As they move, they exchange momentum with their neighbors, and gradually the temperature difference gets smoothed out. Well, back in 2008, a group of researchers at Cambridge University had a pretty clever idea. In other words, a sock. That's exactly what the Cambridge researchers did. By attaching tiny electrodes to the top of the sock, they were able to measure the electrical signal coming from the CLC polymer. Researchers in Japan have recently used them to monitor muscle activity during exercise. In this approach, the sensor is wrapped around a muscle, and the liquid crystals respond to the muscle's electrical activity by changing their helical structure. Because the CLC molecules rotate when they change shape, the sock can also function as a gyroscope, allowing us to measure rotational movement as well, such as these weird spirals that scientists created in 2020. Basically, liquid crystal polymers can be deposited on a surface in such a way that they form a helix, and by shining light on them, researchers can control the pitch of the helix, or in other words, the distance between successive coils. And they found they could get a good reading of the temperature of someone's foot by simply placing a thin layer of CLC material just above the toes. And learn some science while you're at it. You can check out our new course on quantum mechanics. It's a beginner's course that you can take without any background knowledge. You can learn about interference, superpositions, and entanglement, the uncertainty principle, and Bell's theorem. And afterwards, you can keep learning more about the universe with our courses on solar energy, astrophysics, cosmology, and more. All of our courses come with interactive visualizations and follow-up questions. And as always, you'll be learning right alongside some of the smartest people in the world. So go check it out. And there's an obvious application for sports, where athletes need to monitor their own performance, and that wavelength can be anywhere in the visible spectrum. So these CLC spirals could one day be used to build a kind of smart window that changes color, depending on the frequency of light waves hitting it. But beyond that, doctors might one day use these smart socks to monitor patients with diabetes, since people with diabetes tend to have circulation problems, peripheral artery disease, and people who've had an organ transplant. What if they wondered, instead of putting temperature sensors inside a patient, we could just put them on their foot? But it is only when the wavelength of the incident light matches the pitch of the helix that the light gets transmitted. If the wavelength doesn't match, the light gets reflected and the material appears opaque. But hey, maybe one day they'll be as common as glucose monitors or continuous heart rate monitors. Who knows? Of course, that's easier said than done. After all, you don't want to strap a bunch of wires to someone's foot while they're sleeping. And even if you could, wires aren't very comfortable between your toes. In other words, the heat flows from where it is warmer to where it is colder until eventually they reach thermal equilibrium. The molecules now have more freedom of movement, but they're still somewhat restricted compared to molecules in a typical liquid. But with CLC polymers, there's an additional effect. The molecules have electric charges, So when they move from one place to another, they carry charge with them. This creates an electric current. And by measuring the current, we can determine the temperature gradient. These thermochromic socks contain a polymer made from liquid crystals called CLC. The C stands for cholesteric, which refers to the helical shape of the liquid crystal molecules. At rest, these molecules form a kind of spiral where each molecule is aligned with its neighbors along the same axis. Blood is, of course, warm, and the temperature of the blood strongly depends on your body temperature. So a temperature sensor on your foot can tell you quite a bit about your overall health. But because it's a liquid, each molecule has some freedom to move, and actually they can all twist around a bit. So instead of being a regular liquid or a regular crystal, the ground-up salt is what's called a liquid crystal. How is it possible? Well, the answer lies with some liquid crystals. Liquid crystals are substances that have some properties of liquids and some properties of crystals. Liquid crystals don't just come from salt. In fact, many organic compounds can form liquid crystals under the right conditions. And when they do, they often exhibit some really neat optical properties. When an electric current is applied, the molecules straighten up and align with their neighbors. Once they're aligned, they don't reflect much visible light and the sock looks dark. When the current is turned off, the molecules become unaligned and the sock reflects light again. For instance, many liquid crystals have the ability to twist and distort light waves passing through them in a way that depends on the strength of the electric field at the molecule S location. In the case of those color-changing socks, the liquid crystal molecules are white, which means they reflect all colors of visible light. But there's more going on with those magical socks than meets the eye. Let's take a closer look. Now let's say there's a temperature gradient across the material, which there will be if you put your foot in it. If you're thinking this sounds exactly like what happens with heat flow in a metal rod, then you're exactly right. It's the exact same thing. So why would anyone want a sock that does that? But what if you could make a sensor out of something thin, flexible, stretchable, wireless, and washable? The reason this works so well is that the skin on your foot is highly vascularized, meaning there are lots of blood vessels close to the surface. And that's not the only medical application we found for these nifty socks. Japanese researchers have also used similar socks to monitor heart rate by measuring the pulse in your big toe. Of course, while it would be great if everyone could have a pair of these socks, it's likely they'll first be used in clinical settings. And although we've been focusing on socks in this video, CLC materials can be turned into all sorts of other shapes for different applications. When light shines on the CLC, it causes the molecules to transform from their unraveled state to a cholesteric state where they form a helical structure. By controlling the pitch of the helix, scientists can tune the material so that it becomes transparent at a particular wavelength. Thanks for watching this episode. If you'd like to help support the channel,